So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So this is episode 167, which is really a great group chat that we just had with Bask Gill, who's a co-founder of Power. So Power is a marketplace that makes it easier for patients to access clinical health trials. It's an earlier stage marketplace, but is quickly scaling, and over 600,000 patients have used Power. So prior to starting Power, Bask also led growth at Setter, which is required by Thumbtack. So this is a great chat with Bass where we got to learn more about his previous experience leading growth at Setter, some of his key learnings, what the founding story and first steps for starting Power were. We did a deep dive into it as a marketplace for clinical health trials, got to learn more about the recent growth, Series A round, and we also had a great group Q&A. I really enjoyed this conversation, and you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So Bask, welcome to the group chat, and I've been really interested to learn more about Power for a while now. So it's great to have you join us here today, and wanted to start off by saying huge thanks for taking the time to do so in advance. So we have a lot that we're going to dive into with all of your marketplace experience and what you're building with Power now. But before we do, I think it might be great if you can start off by briefly sharing your background for those that don't know you.
I started my career in math research, doing research on financial math, and ended up pretty quickly getting sick of how isolated that work was. And so jumped into startups as a way to apply some of those same tools. Spent a lot of time in performance marketing. Turns out there's similarities between valuing an option and valuing a click. The first company I joined was called Care Guide, competitor to care.com, helped folks find nannies or elder care, that sort of stuff. And we scaled our spend from 500K a year, like sort of 12x over the next few years. You spend enough time focused on marketing and you end up wanting to have a bit of control over the funnel and the broader product. And so ended up getting into growth product through that. After that, started my first business. The goal there was to help employers recruit candidates by highlighting photo, video, and anecdote from their most engaged employees. The product didn't really work well, but there was an underlying job board that did. And so when the novel product didn't work, we kind of transitioned it into a cash flowing business. And my co-founder, Nick, and I jumped off to join other businesses, which is when I joined Setter. Setter was a marketplace for home services, and it was one of the managed marketplaces that were a rather popular trend in the sort of late teens. Backed by Sequoia, Series A startup. Worked at Setter for a number of years. We scaled it up and eventually were acquired by Thumbtack. Spent a little bit of time working at Thumbtack and then ended up starting Power. So
Yeah.
that's the broader trajectory.
Yeah, no, that's a really great background. So thanks for sharing with us. So I want to go back to your experience at Setter, because it definitely sounds like a super interesting marketplace. And as you mentioned, managed marketplace kind of during that era. So could you walk us through, your experience at Setter and, what you're working on at the time?
Yeah, I initially joined very much focused on growth and then ended up sort of hitting a point where the bottleneck in the business was lower down in the funnel. Managed marketplace. So we often had sort of our own pros or experts involved in pricing these jobs. The value prop of Setter was, hey, here's one app for you to get anything done in your home. Take a photo of it. We'll end up getting the job priced and handled. And so started by sort of carving out unique channels that worked well for us. We did a lot of multi-tenanting. So we did a lot of posting pros on different marketplaces to sort of siphon people off. And then eventually ended up building tools for our ops team to get a whole lot faster once the bottleneck was no longer at the top of the funnel. So that was a lot of what I focused on. Setter is a super interesting business. I think really awesome people. Managed marketplaces are super, super hard, particularly in industries with thin margins like home services are. So I'm more skeptical of managed marketplaces today than I was then. I think there's very often a sort of expensive, reliable option in most industries. And a lot of what you're doing with a marketplace is actually allowing people to choose different options. You're allowing them to express different preferences or restrictions, and giving them a different choice outside of that like known brand name. And I think managed marketplaces often end up looking and feeling like the same trade-offs with that known brand name, where they're more expensive because you have to support an ops layer very often. They're more sort of robust or reliable, but it ends up often not being a differentiated offering in the market.
Those are lots of great points. So I guess, kind of looking back though, what were some of your key learnings from Sutter and then maybe subsequently at Thumbtack that you've taken with you to Power?
Yeah. So I think I've talked about this idea of like being a bit skeptical of managed marketplaces, maybe a bit more tactically. The if When you have an ops layer at a marketplace business, trying to ensure that they're only working on things they need to do once per unit of supply, rather than things that need to be done once per transaction. Really, really important because things that you have to do once per transaction with humans just don't scale. I think I also saw like, I was at Setter through COVID, and it was impressive to me how talent density is like a really defensible asset in a company. We had all these great people, and there were all these ups and downs, and people stuck around for a really, really long time, which was super cool to see. I think I also, I think we did an okay job of it, Setter, that I've internalized as being important is that like if you're vacuuming up VC dollars, you really need to be using those dollars to think longer term. And so at Power, a thing we do is right after we raise a round, we like very much for the next, few quarters, half a year, whatever, are focused on long-term bets with the understanding that as we go to raise our next round, we will shrink our focus and necessarily have to tighten up sort of short-term wins in order to have the numbers that get the next stage of investor excited. But being really explicit about the fact that once you raise money, you've raised that money so you can think long-term and make those large investments, I think is a helpful learning I took from that business.
Yeah. So I guess, transitioning into to a Power, briefly kind of mentioned it, but, what was the founding story for a Power? And I guess, what were the first steps that you took to start as a marketplace?
Super interesting. Kind of like two parts to this question. So got acquired by Thumbtack, lots of awesome people, spent a bit of time learning there, was kind of itchy for a smaller, faster paced team. So Brandon and I, who'd worked together at Setter, started experimenting with different businesses. And we had a bit of a process here. We would every week we'd meet, we'd like pitch each other on ideas until the other person was excited. We'd do a week of sort of research. So trying to, for each of the riskiest assumptions in the business, go and de-risk them with second party research. And then if we were excited about the business still, we'd spend a month just pretending we were actually launching the business. So we'd go and we'd literally sell the thing, we'd literally build the thing, and then we'd do a retro after 1 month. And we'd done this for a few different businesses, and it was really useful because it gave us a feeling for what a hard business felt like. There are certain things that at one point we were trying to sell hotels on letting us turn their gym space into like a collective membership. So like you could have a gym at any city in the world. And it turns out that people who run hotels actually, the GMs, they don't have an incentive to make all that much more money. And so the sales were super, super hard. Anyways, really useful for us to understand what it felt like to be working on a very bad business. And then sort of halfway through this process, my dad got sick. And my dad got multiple myeloma, incurable cancer, really interesting cancer in that right now there's a lot of immunotherapy that's proving to be super, super impactful for these patients. So I was like doing a bunch of research. I was trying to figure out how I could get him to have some of this immunotherapy. He's in Vancouver, Canada, a few years behind the US. And his oncologist, I was trying to go back and forth and negotiate with him and explore these trials because nothing had been approved yet that was immunotherapy. And the oncologist got really frustrated and sort of demanded that we proceed with the treatment he recommended. And that was really rough for a few reasons. One, my dad responded super poorly to it. Turns out it was an outdated treatment. He went from 190 pounds to 120 pounds. He's a 6 foot tall dude, had a really rough go. And then also, I didn't know this, but he ended up disqualifying himself from a lot of the potential trials that were running for this CAR T immunotherapy. And so overall, the experience was pretty awful. And we'd been aware of clinical trials as a space, and really me going through this experience had us go, hey, surely we could build something better here. Surely, like, I have a science background. I can read the papers, and was still completely unable to get him into a trial.
I mean, that's such a meaningful story, and the real why behind starting up Power. So thanks for sharing with us on that. So what were the first steps then that you took to actually starting Power as a marketplace?
So we started with the side of the marketplace we understood, which is the patient side, right? I'd gone through that experience. I knew what I wanted. So that was a natural place to focus. And then we started by building a tool rather than really a marketplace. So we built sort of like Zillow did, a better search engine, but for clinical trials. The status quo today, all these trials are listed online on a government website, clinicaltrials.gov. That website is written by PhDs for PhDs. And so we spent a lot of time using, at the time, like GPT-2 to simplify this language and make it sort of comprehensible for a layperson. Then we spent a bunch of time pulling out key attributes of these trials, making them searchable and comparable so that there was something valuable to patients, even when we didn't yet have supply on the platform. So that's where we started. And then once we saw that we were starting to have a bunch of organic traffic from Google and patients were going through this experience and expressing interest, we started building out the supply side. And what we did there is we focused on like the group of folks who were just like quickest to make a decision. This ended up being the participants in the ecosystem who were least professional. So there were these researchers at academic medical centers, at hospitals, at schools, who had small grants and wanted some help running recruiting patients for their trials. They were super price sensitive. They could pay us, $8 a patient or something like this, but they could also make a decision sort of same day, same week. And so we started validating that someone would pay for this thing by going directly to those folks. And then over time, we've seen that, hey, these folks who are sort of on the not yet professionalized end of the spectrum, they don't have budgets. They don't make a ton of money from this research. And so we've had to move towards increasingly professional segments of the market. And we found that actually you can go too far in the other direction too. So if you're working with networks of clinics run by PE firms, actually they're super good at compressing all the margin out of their vendors, out of the people they work with. So actually the sweet spot is the middle of the professionalism curve, where, hey, they know how to run a business and can make money and thus can give some of that money to you, but they also need help. Whereas the really professional folks might have internal marketing teams and they've sort of already solved the problem in a way that means your potential to add value is pretty minimal.
No, that's a really great point as far as you mentioned on the kind of curve of professionalism. So a lot of times, that kind of changes marketplaces in the earlier stages.
I think it's under discussed, and I think like it's heartbreaking, but I think there have been 3 different times where we've sort of fired large portions of our customer base just because we were doing a pretty good job for them, but we were clearly doing a better job for some other segment. So I think that's natural and probably a good sign if you're doing that a decent bit in the early days.
Yeah, and I realize that might be helpful. Could you give us just for a brief, bit of context, can you give us an overview of Power today as a marketplace?
Yeah, totally. Pharma companies and biotech companies come to us because every drug you can take in the US has to go through 3 rounds of clinical testing to prove that it's safe in humans and that it's efficacious. It does what it's purported to do. It heals some illness. That testing for a given drug that gets approved costs between $1 and $2 billion. It takes about 10 years to bring a drug to market. And that whole time that the trials are running, the patent is expiring. And so these companies have 20 years where they can market the drug under patent. They're really incentivized to try and get this thing to market faster. Pretty much all of that cost and like duration is because it's really hard to find patients for these trials. So there's a huge, component of this industry where folks really want to find more patients. On the flip side, there are lots of patients for whom currently approved therapies don't work well. Maybe they've tried them all, maybe you have friends who've tried a bunch of SSRIs for depression and nothing has worked. Or maybe the side effects are unbearable. There's other folks with orphan illnesses who don't have any drug available to them. And then there's some people who like to do the research. This is actually pretty common in cancer. And what they found is that actually the most promising treatment, like I found, was currently in clinical trials. And so there are all these groups of folks who are interested in engaging with research who right now don't have a way to get access. I'd mentioned earlier this government website that's written for PhDs, really hard to parse. Well, the other thing is that there's very unreliable contact information on this website. And so we ran some testing and we saw that of 100 different clinics you might want to reach out to here, only 5% had emails that were being responded to. And so you do all this research and then you wouldn't hear back from anybody on the other side. There's some funny reasons for that. Pharma worries about competitors stealing their clinics. And so they often mask this information and don't want to give it away when they don't see the potential to recruit patients with it. But when they work with us, they're happy to share it because they know it'll be used to get patients into trials. So we're helping pharma save time getting their drugs to market, save costs getting their drugs to market, and we're helping patients access therapies who very often wouldn't have another option.
And that's really helpful. So I guess if we kind of like break down each side, right, and we kind of like start on the patient side, you briefly mentioned earlier as far as like SEO, but how are you reaching patients and acquiring patients?
Yeah. Um, Early on, we spent a lot of time focused on programmatic search. And the reason for that is that there are people literally searching for condition name clinical trials, and there's really not a good like product experience for them in the search results. So that was our first channel, and we spent a lot of time focused on making that work. Increasingly, we're using other channels. So we're seeing more and more patient-based referrals, and we're actually finding sort of community referrals as a pretty powerful source of these patients. So we've gone as far as building tooling so that the Multiple Myeloma Foundation can have a trial finder, a little product experience tailored to their community that ends up helping their users find promising trials and then redirecting them back to Power. So we're doing more and more to like embed ourselves in these existing communities and then also continuing to acquire folks through search.
Is there like a local nature as well to it? So, focusing on certain kind of markets or geos?
Yeah, so there certainly is for most conditions. Very often for cancer, folks are willing to travel pretty far, and so it's more of like a global network effect you're building. But with psychiatry, where we've had a lot of success, people typically don't want to travel more than 50 miles. We early on, to prove that this thing was generally valuable to patients, did a lot of horizontal building, right? We built these programmatic pages for every condition and for every possible treatment and whatever. And now that we've seen that that is working, we're more and more focusing in a deep way. And we spent a lot of time and effort sort of building tools that were specific to oncology. Now we're doing the same for psychiatry and building sort of the classic category-based playbook that you can roll out to these different condition areas.
Got it. Yeah, you mentioned a few different topics. I was going to ask about first about network effects, and then two, as far as like the expansion and kind of growth playbook. But it sounds like on a category level, is that how you're kind of approaching expansion and growth?
Yeah, totally. It's interesting because while we built for patients initially, patients don't have an enduring need, right? And so the way you build sort of the classic network effect is by building relationships with the clinics and having the clinics like using your tool so much that they not only like add all their trials that they're running, but they actually advocate for the pharma company to pay for you to be supporting their recruitment. So started with a patient-based approach. It's hard for you to build like a classic network effect on the patient side. It's really a function of like rate of patient acquisition because that need expires on their side. So it's really about channels and being really good at things like SEO. And then the way we're building the network effect on the supply side is by building deep relationships with these clinics. Most folks in this space start by helping sort of one clinic recruit for one trial. It turns out the very good clinics aren't thinking about recruitment on a single trial basis. They take a patient and they evaluate them against every clinical trial they're running. And so we've built a number of tools to make it easier for them to do that sort of multi-trial evaluation. And then increasingly, we're trying to take other tools that they currently pay for and bundle them into our platform such that they're more deeply embedded with Power.
That's a good kind of transition right over to the to the trial side. I was actually going to ask about it, So I take it like you're selling into the clinics and
Super interesting. So it's a funny marketplace because it's actually a two-sided marketplace, patient and clinic, but it's paid for by a third party, which is pharma, right? And so you sell to pharma, but the interaction is actually a two-sided interaction. Um, we initially did sell to these clinics. And so what we found is that because they are so much further down in the value stack, pharma pays like a CRO, which is like an operating company, who then recruits the clinics who run the actual trial. And there's 150 to 300 clinics. And because there's all these middle people in the way, clinics have small budgets and thin margins. And so we've shifted from trying to make any real money off them to giving our tool away for free. And in some ways, allowing them to spend money that would have gone to maybe a marketing agency through Power at no cost to them, so that we can build a relationship and then eventually charge pharma. So we have a B2B sales team who's working on just cracking the top 20 large pharma companies, and also selling to maybe small biotechs, we call them, who are happy to move faster. And then all the sort of growth or acquisition of these clinics either comes because we've sold to one of these pharma companies who enrolls the clinics, or comes through product-led growth. So if a patient reaches out to a trial that isn't already on the platform, we do a bunch of things to try and pull that the clinic on the other side who's closest to them into the platform so they can engage with that patient. It improves the patient experience because they actually get a reply. And then, we're building out the supply side.
well, that's really interesting to learn more about. So appreciate the breakdown on it. So we have lots of founders in the community kind of building in healthcare, kind of medical and pharma as well. So are there any learnings, recent learnings as far as like building in the space that might be helpful that you can share with us?
Healthcare is a funny spot for a marketplace, because a lot of marketplaces get started, as you all know as well as I do, by sort of like moving really fast and being really scrappy. And like that doesn't really fly in healthcare. Um, uh, and so I think we've had to make parts of our business look less like a marketplace to get started and to get initial adoption. And then we're transitioning folks into a truer marketplace model over time. So for example, the very first pharma and biotech companies who were paying us, they bought something that looked very much more like what they would pay an agency for than a typical marketplace. And when we showed them pricing that looked more like, hey, pay on the transaction level, they almost got a little bit spooked. And so we went back to this model of like, hey, this is like a fixed fee, maybe a little bit of outcome-based payment, but it's actually mostly a fixed fee, even though in theory this would be worse for them just because they were more comfortable with it. It was less sort of scary and unknown.
That's going to be really helpful. So. And I believe as well another topic actually that I wanted to bring up was your Series A announcement, more recently. So could you
Yeah.
maybe share a little bit more about what the fundraising journey has been like?
Yeah, we got kind of lucky in that we raised our pre-seed in 2021 when everyone with a keyboard could kind of, if they were lucky and knew a person or two, could raise a pre-seed. And then since then, we've been lucky to partner with really awesome VCs. I think a few learnings here. One, in whatever round you are taking on your first board member, we didn't optimize for valuation. We optimized for the person who like felt most long-term in orientation. So not only did we get along and were they insightful, but they seemed to think in like 10-year timelines, not 2, 5, 7-year timelines. And that has really proven to be a good decision we made. Another thing we noticed is that there's pretty different dynamics comparing, maybe call them solo VCs or newer operators to tier one firms. With the big name brand firms, we ended up not really approaching anybody until we had multiple term sheets. It seems like folks weren't pretty much they all often have the opportunity not to move until somebody else has like proven your value. And so it's kind of a waste to spend any time talking to them until the very end of the process. And then we were surprised to learn just how fast these firms could move. Very often, if we had an in-person meeting with them on Friday, they'd be able to turn around decisions by Monday. And so it was okay that we left them until the very end of their process. They're used to operating from that standpoint. The smaller sort of like independent VCs or newer firms, they need a bunch more time. And they want to build a relationship, and they really don't want to feel like they're involved in a process and being sort of competed against each other. So it made a lot more sense to have start with them early in the process and then end with the tier one firms or the name brand firms, let's call them. So that was one takeaway. That was one takeaway from the fundraising. I think, start earlier than you think you need to. I mean, ask for advice, not for money, these sorts of things. In earlier rounds, it was more, we were intentional about communicating that we were raising less than we intended to, so we could be oversubscribed really quickly. In earlier rounds, we also tried to line up a bunch of practice calls with folks who wouldn't have been too upset about getting a no from. So we got lots of reps in before we talked to our favorites. Yeah, yeah.
This is going to be a great kind of learnings and also tips for other founders as well here. So cool. So actually, I had a question that I wanted to ask that someone sent me earlier, which is around the importance of trust, for marketplaces. And I can imagine with power, it's increasingly important with people trusting you with their health and entering these trials. So how have you thought about building trust directly with patients?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in this vein, we've had to go pretty deep on the kinds of things we can and can't communicate about a clinical trial, because it is regulated. In theory, every piece of advertising, I mean, not in theory, in practice, every explicit ad you run about a given trial needs to be approved by an ethics committee, called an IRB, an internal review board. And so you have to be really conscious of how you're speaking about these things. Our approach has been to like try to really simplify information and then present it in a plain way for folks. So for example, we've got some work right now, and we've started to roll out simple bar chart comparisons of efficacy. For this antidepressant, it might be that in the first 60 days, people who are on it see their depression score drop by 20%. With this other antidepressant, it might drop by 35%. But then looking down below this, hey, antidepressant 2 also has more reports of insomnia. So our approach is really to present the data plainly and trust folks to be able to interpret and choose what's best for them. And then we're increasingly trying to provide longer form resources for folks who want to get up to speed on what these different measures mean, and how the industry has moved over time. We're in depending on your marketplace, if people naturally already do a lot of researching, if it's an important decision, we've been surprised at how many minutes people will spend scrolling through blog after long form guide after long form guide. So trying to weave those into the product has been helpful.
Yeah, I can only imagine as far as content marketing and a lot of the educational content that you can create.
Yeah, totally.
I did have another question, Bask, that I wanted to ask. I'll just jump in here myself, take all the time up. But, what is the monetization like at Power, and has that changed? As you've kind of scaled.
Initially, like I said, the people who would move fastest with us were used to buying marketing agencies, where it was a flat fee and no guarantee of down funnel performance. And so initially we sold that just to move quickly. Then we started exploring having all the enrollment at all the monetization at the enrollment step. So when someone actually signs a form, they're fully qualified for this trial. they're going to participate. What we saw with that is we were taking on so much risk that we had to make the patients so expensive that when they did the apples to apples on a per patient basis, it actually wasn't that attractive. And so this is a little bit of a learning in like a B2B marketplace for me, is that it's you don't need to be 10x better. Like you almost want to be 50% better across every dimension. And so what we've done is we have sort of flat fees that are recurring for these biotechs. We then charge them some amount for a mid-funnel success. You can think of this when we pull a patient's medical record, for example, right? That patient has expressed a lot of interest. They're moving through the process. Okay, we'll charge you a very small amount for this. When they show up for an appointment, maybe we charge them there. And then when they actually prove to be fully qualified, they will charge them again. This allows us to de-risk the funnel such that they don't have to pay this huge amount that seems unwieldy every time we do actually get an enrollment.
I'm sure there's a lot of testing around that too as well. So
yeah, and all the kudos to my co-founder Brandon, who for a number of years pretty relentlessly was like trying different things here. So
cool. We're gonna get into the actual Q&A with some founders since we have some raised hands now. Hey, Josh, do you want to come on?
I'm Josh. I'm the founder of Jaw House, which is just launched an MVP a few weeks ago, so very early stage.
congrats. Yeah.
Thank you. The question I have, and I have a marketing background. You talk about marketing a bit. How did you balance out? Because you talk a lot about content and SEO as a huge thing. How did you balance out building that from day one, knowing it might be a bit more of a long tail versus maybe some more expensive performance marketing strategies? And what was sort of your approach to that, either in this business or in any others?
Yeah, great question. So we had the luxury of having enough runway such that we were pretty confident we'd be able to see some results from search that we could then we kind of knew we'd probably want to be able to reference that in our next raise. For context, we're in health. We saw pretty meaningful traffic within the year of having shipped these first pages. And so we actually sort of removed core pieces of the patient experience that we could have built and instead built these pages right out of the gate and used them in place of what might have been a slightly better experience, but that wouldn't have ranked in Google. So we did it out of the gate because we knew we had at least a year to like let these things grow. I would say that if you have a year and you want to be able to tell a story around search, it's pretty doable to show promising early signs. And the only caveat there is that we did do a little bit of backlinking work, which people say, increasingly, oh, this doesn't matter, just make the best content. When you're a brand new website and you're in health, like it totally does matter. And so we built a really bad version of that trial finder I described earlier for patient advocacy groups to put on their website in the very, very early days. So that's how we were confident in like investing in SEO out of the gate. And then we've honestly we tested a bunch of different paid channels and then just picked one and said, we're going to get really good at this. I think I could see you nodding your head. Like most folks who've spent some time in marketing realize that like doing lots of things is a great way to like lose money on all of them. It's hard to be profitable in any one domain. And so we've been really intentional about just doing Facebook paid as our main paid channel. Yeah.
Hey, Dimitri, do you want to come on? So raise your hand.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're reporting kind of preliminary efficacy numbers to your users. And I'm kind of worried, how do you think about how much of that is sort of noise versus true clinical numbers? And my second question is, how do you kind of handle this, with the fact you have rival pharma companies that may be very much interested in this information, or you have investors that would really like to know if some clinical trial is starting to look good? How do you kind of think about those two things?
Yeah, really good questions. So the first thing I'll say is there's a bunch of ways we think about presenting data in a way that is just like honest and transparent. So always reporting participant numbers, right? How many, like, is this N of 6 or N of 60 and some of this stuff, and making clear what N means, because for lots of folks that doesn't mean anything. We're exploring different ways of communicating this. I think we could probably do a better job. But for example, you could imagine using color as a dimension, or opacity as a dimension, to make clear how like robust or actually like flimsy and novel this data is. So hey, it might be a higher bar, but if it's really low opacity, or if it's a soft blue versus a bright purple, is that like a gauge users can tap into to understand how reliable that data is? And then we've also in some of our visuals presented confidence intervals. I don't think that's a great solution, because I don't think people always understand them, but we're trying things. And I think we have a habit of showing stuff to the folks who are consuming it and understanding when it's sort of missing the mark. We also always link out to the primary literature, and we'll encourage folks who want to dive deeper to dig into that. As of right now, we don't have proprietary efficacy or safety data. We have sort of more usefully packaged safety and efficacy data. So everything we have lives in a journal article somewhere, can be referenced, and we've just pulled it out and like made it comprehensible to a typical person, or tried to. And what I would say is we do have pharma and investors who are sort of interested in some of this data. I think there's a lot of potential for data products in this space. And we view that opportunity through some of the lenses I just mentioned, which is that is this going to be a quick sales cycle? Will it actually accelerate our time to get the recruitment contract that we're ultimately after? Really thoughtful questions, though.
That's a good kind of segue in. You mentioned a few different opportunities right within data. So what can we expect from Power in the next 5 to 10 years if we kind of fast forward?
What I would love for this to look like on the supply side, or the pharma and biotech side, is something almost like Fulfilled by Amazon, but for clinical trials, right? Like how can we, if we've built the tech that's powering these clinics, and collected all the data on where patients are and which doctors and physicians are most responsive and who's enrolling, how can we use that to help new companies who are trying to bring a novel drug to market to really easily run their first few trials, and do that in a pretty hands-off way? Right now, the companies who facilitate this use tons of humans, and there is a lot there, but I think eventually it could broadly be handled by software. And then on the patient side, I think a thing we say internally is that very often patients are looking for treatment, not for trials, right? Like the trial is a way for them to get help. And so in that vein, I think we start to think about, are there other, we're presenting clinical trials right now. Do we actually need to support other interventions, right? Okay, you're coming to us, maybe you're looking for a trial, but maybe just your SSRI isn't working, and the best option for you is actually a different approved therapy. How can we maybe work with existing marketplaces to make a referral, or find some other way to ensure that patient is getting the best help possible? I think the thing that is enduring in the world in this space is the one that isn't committed to just approved drugs or just clinical trials, but is really focused on like, what is the most helpful thing for the patient? How will they best heal?
Well, we once again really appreciate taking the time to join us today, and sharing all of your great experience, and also doing a deep dive into Power as a marketplace. So super interesting, and congrats on all the recent progress. So and I had one last question for you before we kind of wrap things up here, which is my kind of closing question, which is, if you could go right back to before you entered the world of marketplaces, what would you tell yourself about them specifically?
These things are lots of fun and hard. So be prepared for lots of both of those things. Yeah.
That's going to be a great kind of parting advice for us. And then last but not least, time for a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
Yeah. If you well, I'll plug Power. If you want to search for Power, it's withpower.com. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Twitter. I'm on Twitter as Hey Bask, and we're decently present on Reddit as well. But that's not really a place you look for companies like us. So yeah, would love a follow.
Awesome. Well, I'll include links in the recording, and I'm sure you'll have lots of founders and teams coming your way. So thanks again for the awesome chat, and thanks for the great questions from everyone.